Be'ezras Hashem, we're beginning today a new set of halachot. Hilchos Maaser, the laws of the first tithe. So on the chart we see the classic gifts of produce that we give. First of all, we give what's called truma, 2% to the Kohen. That was the whole last 2 weeks, the laws of truma. Then we're going to be moving to what's called Maaser Rishon, the first tithe. It's called first because there's going to be other ones. But in the halachas, the Rambam just calls it Maaser. It's just plain Maaser. Whenever you have the word Maaser, it means the 10% that goes to the Levi. Okay, I'm not going to, since we're going in for also 2 weeks on this one, so instead of using the fancy English word tithe that nobody knows what it means anyways, we're just going to use the word Maaser, the Hebrew word. Maaser means 10% of the grain that goes to the Levi. Says the Rambam, mitzvah achas. It's quite unique. Usually we have multiple mitzvahs in each set of laws. This set of laws is dedicated to only one mitzvah, v'hu, which is lahafrish Maaser Rishon b'chol shana v'shana mishnas hazriya, to separate one tithe, 10% every year of the planting years, because every 7 years there's Shemitah when we don't separate Maaser, but at least during the 6 planting years, you should separate 10%, v'litna l'Levim, and give it to the Levi. Ubir mitzvah zu b'prakim elu, the explanation of this mitzvah is coming in the following 14 chapters, God willing. Says the Rambam, Perek Rishon, chapter 1, halacha aleph. Achar shemafrishin truma gdoila. After separating the great truma, the 2% of the Kohen, mafrish echad me'asara min hanishar. From what remains, you have to take 10%. So it's not 10% from the beginning stock. It's after you take the 2%, whatever is left, you take 10%. So if you had 100 apples, let's say, so you take 2 apples, give it to the Kohen, now you only have 98 left. So for the Levi, you only have to take 9.8 apples, not a whole 10. V'zeu hanikra Maaser Rishon. This is called the first 10%. Uboy nemar, it's about this 10%, which the Torah says, Kies Maaser b'nei Yisrael asher yarimu laHashem. The 10% of the Jewish people, which they lift up to Hashem, that's describing the Maaser that goes to the Levites. The HaMaaser hazel ha'Leviim zecharim u'nekeves, it belongs to the Levites, whether they're male or female. Anybody can, it's not a male thing. Shenemar, as it says, v'livnei Levi, hine nosati kol Maaser b'Yisrael l'nachala. To the children of Levi, I'm giving all the Maaser, all the 10% of the Jews, as an inheritance. Everybody gets to inherit. And the Torah uses the word b'nei, the general term, children of Levi, so it applies both to men and to women. Halacha beis, Maaser Rishon mutar ba'achila liYisrael. Although primarily it's given to the Levites, truth is any Jew can eat Maaser. Unlike Truma, let's say, only belongs to a Kohen, only a Kohen can eat it. If you give a Levi 10%, and the Levi decides to be generous and give it back to you, you can eat it. Umutar la'achle betuma. It's even able to be eaten in a state of impurity. She'ein by kedusha klal. It has no holiness at all. It's simply a gift, a monetary gift. It's like tzedakah. Truma has a holiness. Maaser has no holiness. The Rabbi would use this halacha to explain that the main lesson from Maaser is acknowledging la Hashem ha'aretz umlo'ah, that everything belongs to God. You have to find the holiness even in the regular stuff in your life. V'chol makom shenemar b'Maaser is kodesh ay pediyah. Wherever you're going to see in the laws related to tithing the term holiness or redemption, einei ela Maaser sheni. That's only referring to the second 10%. Second 10% goes to Yerushalayim. It has a holiness, not the first one. Uminayin sheMaaser Rishon chulin. How do we know that the first Maaser is called regular grain, shenemar, because it says, V'nechshav lachem trumaschem kadogan min hagoyren v'chamlea min hayokef. Torah first says, I'm going to consider your separated grains, like grain from the granary and like produce from the vat, from the wine press. Torah specifically uses the word goyren v'yekev. Ma goyren v'yekev chulin l'chol davar. The same way that whatever happens in the granary or in the vat is totally chulin, totally regular grain, for all matters. Af Maaser Rishon shenitla trumasai, so too the first tithe, as long as the Levi takes the 10% and gives it to the Kohen, as we learned in the last set of laws, chulin l'chol davar, whatever remains, is totally chulin for all matters. Lefichach, therefore, bas Levi shenishbeis. Oy shenivala be'ilas nus, if you have a daughter of a Levi who was taken captive, or she engaged in a promiscuous relationship, noisnin la ha'Maaser v'oicheles, you can give her the Maaser, she can eat it, no problem. But if somebody was caught in a bit of a problematic situation, a woman heard that her husband died, or one witness testified that he died, and she got married, which is allowed, and then her husband shows up, one of the penalties that the sages imposed is that she is forbidden to have Maaser, even though by all regular laws she should be able to have it, but over here, because of this unique problem that arose, she cannot eat it. But in general, everybody can eat it. Halacha Gimel. Leviim the Koyanim mafrishin Maaser Rishon. Even a Levi and even a Kohen need to take Maaser, the first tithe, from their grain. Kedei lahafrish mimenu trumas Maaser. In order to be able to take the 10% from the 10%. In other words, even though they're getting the gifts in the end of the day, but you have to separate that part, that holier part, from the Maaser, and therefore you have to first take 10%, and from that 10%, take 10%. So to Kohanim take all the other trumas and all the other tithes. They can give it to themselves, but they have to separate it from their grain. Since the Kohanim can take all the gifts, people might think that they can eat their own fruit in a state of tevel, in a state of being untithed. No. Talmud Lerma, therefore the Torah says right afterwards, Kain tarimu gam atem. So too should you separate also. Who's the so too should you? From tradition we learn, atem elu halevim, gam atem l'rabes hakoyanim. You, Torah is referring to the Levi, you also have to take the gifts, and then it says also you, an extra word, even the koyanim have to take the gifts. Halacha dalid, ein moitziin hamaiser miyad hakoyanim. Although the koyanim have to separate the 10% from their produce, the Levis can't take it from them. We can't force it out of the kohanim's hands. Shanemar, because it says, Ki sikhu me'es b'nei Yisrael. When Hashem told the Levites you could take Maaser, they said you could take it only from the regular Jews, not from the Kohanim. Kohen wants to give it to the Levi, sure, but you can't force it. V'chein kol matnes kahuna, ein moitzin oisam mekoyin lekoyin. Any other gifts of the Kohanim? There are 24 gifts that the Kohanim get, which we're going to explore in detail in the laws of Bikurim. You can't take them from one Kohen to another because it belongs to them inherently. The Ezra Konas as Halevim bizmanai. Ezra the scribe was the Jewish leader when the Jewish people were leaving Babylon, coming back to Israel for the second time. And at the time, there was a whole story there where some of the Jewish people did not want to come back to Israel, especially the Levites, the Levim. And at that time, Ezra fined them. He gave them a penalty. He said, no more are you going to be getting Maaser. They're going to be moved to the Kohanim. This is supposed to be a depiction of it, because they didn't go up to Jerusalem with him. That was his way of getting back at them. Now there's two interpretations into what happened. In other words, how this decree worked. Does it mean that it can only be given to the Kohanim and never again to the Levites? Most people don't explain it that way. The Radvaz, for example, he says that Ezra's point was that if you have a Kohen and a Levi, you should give it to the Kohen. But if you have no Kohen, you can for sure give it to the Levi. Others say that it was only applicable at that time. At that time, the Levites didn't go up, so he penalized them. Later on, more Levites did come to Eretz Yisrael, and Ezra took back his decree, and so it went back to being allowed to give to the Levites, but not to nullify Ezra's decree totally. They kept giving it to the priests as well. That's two ways to explain what Ezra's penalty and the effect of it was. Halacha hey, ha'oichel pirdeisav tvalin. If somebody doesn't listen to Hashem and he eats his produce untithed, v'chein Levi she'achal ha'maiser betivloi, or if a Levi eats his Maaser in its state of being untithed, meaning he doesn't take the 10% for the Kohen, the Trumas Maaser. Even though they're liable to death penalty from heaven, they don't have to pay back any financial restitution to the proper owners. Let's say, unlike Truma, right? When you eat Truma, you got to pay back to the Kohen. But here, you don't have to pay back. Shenemar, because it says, the gifts, where's the pasuk here? The gifts which they lift to Hashem. Which means, the only right that the Levi has to the Maaser is once it's lifted. But if the Jew didn't even separate it from his produce, so they have no rights to it. As a matter of fact, in the diaspora, says the Rambam, so if a person so chooses, he can eat from his produce straight and later give the tithes. No need to give them first before you eat them. Halacha Vav, the Rambam notes some comparisons and some differences between Maaser and Truma. Maaser mimakim ze al makim acher, ve'ein tzarich la'aser min hamukaf. Unlike Truma, where you have all the Truma that you take needs to be in the same location, When it comes to Maaser, you're allowed to take Maaser from the food that you have in this house to cover the food that you have in another house. They don't have to be together. But like Truma, you cannot take Maaser from one species onto another species. You can't take from grain which is obligated to be tithed to cover grain that's exempted to be tithed, nor from grain that's exempted to be tithed to cover grain that's obligated to be tithed. If you took such Maaser, it's nothing, it's worthless. Halacha Zayin, another comparison. Any scenario where we said by Truma that you cannot separate from one produce onto another, Kach b'Maaser. Same thing by Maaser. Ein ma'asrin mizeh al zeh. You cannot take Maaser from one to the other. For example, we said that you can't take Maaser from produce that's attached to cover produce that's detached from the ground. Or you can't take Truma, from one year onto another year. Or from the diaspora to cover Eretz Yisrael. Same thing with Maaser. Any scenario when it came to Truma where we said that ideally you shouldn't take the Truma, but if you did, after the fact it's a Truma, so too with Maaser, if you took it, it is considered to be, after the fact, Maaser. For example, you separated Truma from stuff that the work wasn't entirely completed. Same thing with Maaser, after the fact it's Maaser. Or you took lower grade, lower class produce to cover higher class produce. Or you unknowingly separated impure produce for pure produce. All these cases we said, ideally it's not Truma, after the fact it is. Same thing with Maaser, ideally it's not Maaser, after the fact it is. Any scenario where produce is exempt from Truma, it's also exempt from Maaser. For example, if it's not fit for human consumption, or the gifts to the poor, the fallen stocks, the forgotten stocks, the peah, you don't have to take Truma, nor Maaser. Any Jew who is fit to take the Truma is fit to separate Maaser. There was 5 people that we said about them that they shouldn't take Truma. But if they did, after the fact it's Truma, Kachim Isru, Maaser and Maaser. So too, if they took Maaser, it's also effective. For example, a person who's deaf but not mute, or a mute who's not deaf, a naked person, drunk person, blind person. Any of the 5 people which we said that their Truma is totally ineffective, also their Maaser is totally ineffective. Who were those 5 people? A person who's deaf and mute, mentally unstable, a child, a Gentile who separates produce from a Jew, or a Jew who separates produce from another Jew without permission. Halacha ches. This is an interesting halacha. You have 2 completely opposite explanations in the commentaries. So I'll first give you the Kesef Mishnah, and then we'll do the Radvaz. So the Kesef Mishnah translates as follows. Ha'omer lachavere. A person tells his friend, Hareini me'aser al yadecha. Look, I'll save you some work. I'm going to take Maaser for you. So in other words, the agent is telling the owner, I'm going to take Maaser for you. The owner doesn't have to stand with him and make sure whether or not he takes Maaser. Why? Because if the agent came forward so excitedly, hey, I want to do this for you, so probably he's going to do it. But if it was the owner who told the agent, Aser al yadai, you take Maaser for me, even if the guy agrees, since you appointed him, you have to make sure. You have to stand with him. So according to the Kesef Mishnah, if the agent came forward himself, he doesn't have to be supervised. If he was asked by the owner, he has to be supervised. Now let's read that halacha again, as the Radvaz translates it in the complete opposite way. If the owner tells the agent, the owner tells his friend, Hareini ma'aser al yadecha, I'm relying on you to take Maaser. Here the Rambam says, Einay tzarich lamid imay, ad sheyire im ya'aser elo ya'aser. He doesn't have to supervise him to see whether he's going to take Maaser or not, because you've clearly told the agent that you're relying on him. But if the agent came over to the owner, literally opposite. The agent tells the owner, Aser al yadai, hey, pick me, let me do the Maaser for you, tzarich la'amid imay. Even if the owner agrees, he has to stand with him, because he didn't appoint the agent. So it's very interesting. You see how the Rambam sometimes can be translated in 2 opposite ways. It actually comes from the Gemara. The Talmud Yerushalmi is a little bit cryptic in describing the law, so the commentaries argue in the interpretation over there, so they automatically argue the interpretation over here. Halacha tes hecharuvin karib. This is karib on the left. Einan chayavin b'maisreis ela midivreim. They don't have to be taken tithed from, only rabbinically. Lefisha einan maichal reiv adam, because they're not eaten by most people. And the commentaries say that the Rambam later differentiates between carobs that grow in different regions. Here he's referring to the one that grows in the region where it's not fit for human consumption. There are other carobs that are fit for consumption and actually have to be tithed biblically. Bitter almonds, bein begadlan, bein bekatnan, whether they're big or small, pturin, they're exempt because they are not food. We'll see later that the regular almonds, when they begin to grow, they're bitter. So then everybody agrees that they're exempt. But if they're essentially bitter almonds, then no matter how big they get, they're always exempt. Halacha Yud, Ilan Shanate B'Sei Chabayis. Okay, we have a picture. You planted a tree in the middle of a house. Poter mi Maaser. Any fruits that grow on the tree is exempt from Maaser. Shenemar, because it says, Aser to Aser. Eis kol tevuas zarecha hayoytze hasoda. You have to tithe all the grain of your produce that comes out in the field, not in the house. V'yeroeli, says the Rambam, it seems to me though, shehu chayav b'maisris midivrei, that at least rabbinically, it's obligated to have Maaser taken from it. Sharei te'ena ha'imedes b'chotzer chayav la'aser pereisayim asfan ka'achas. We know that if a fig tree is standing in your yard, if you gather all the figs at once, you have to take Maaser from the figs. So why should a tree in your house be different, at least rabbinically? Halacha Yud Aleph, b'tzalim shehishrishu zeh b'tzad zeh. If onions take root, one next to the other, afilu hishrishu bekarka aliyah, even if they take root in the roof of an attic, which they can do if there's the proper conditions. P'turin min ha-Maaser, they're exempt from Maaser. Nofla alein mapoiles, if an avalanche fell on them, meaning onto the roof of the attic where they were taking root. And now they're open to the air. They're no longer considered to be planted in the house. They're like planted in the field, and they have to be taken Maaser from them. If somebody is guarding his field because of his grapes. Okay, I have a picture of a person guarding his cucumber field. But let's just imagine they were grapes, okay? And as the commentaries explain it, figs are harvested before grapes. So this person in his field had both figs and grapes. Most of the figs were harvested. There were a couple of figs left, but he was mainly guarding his field now to protect the grapes. Comes somebody else and takes all the remaining figs in the field. Or he was watching his field because of the cucumbers. Here we are. And the squash. And somebody comes and takes the grapes that are left in the field. Because cucumber and squash were harvested even after grapes. So it could be all of his grapes were harvested, and there's just a few grapes left, but he's still guarding his field from the cucumbers and squash. Basically, the question is, if you're guarding your field for one type of produce, is your mind also on the other type of produce, even if there's very little left? So the Rambam says it depends on each person. It's a case-to-case basis. If the owner of the field is particular, that you shouldn't take his grapes nor his figs, his cucumbers nor his grapes, asurin mishum gezel, it would be forbidden on account of stealing if you took it. And therefore those produce are also going to be obligated to be tithed if you want to eat them. And if the owner is not particular about them, he's only guarding his field not because of his grapes. He doesn't care about his figs, or he's only guarding his field about his cucumbers, not about his grapes. Mutarin mishum gezel. So they would be permitted on account of stealing. You could take them. It's not considered theft. Upturin min ha-Maaser, and therefore they're exempt from being tithed, taking Maaser from them. Halacha Yud Gimel, ein ma'asrin ela min ha-muvchar. You can only take Maaser from the choicest produce, like by Truma. Shenemar, as it says, Baharimchem eschel boy mimenu. So this verse is talking actually about Trumas Maaser, the 10% which the Levites take from their Maaser. And Hashem says, you should take the choicest part from it. V'nechshav la-levim kisvuas geiden v'chisvuas Yaakov. And then, whatever remains will be considered for the Levites like regular grain. They can eat it after they take their portion. But the Torah makes a point to say that the Trumas Maaser has to be the choicest part. So the Rambam learns from this, Keshem sheMaaser shemafrishim alevim, min ha'chelev shabai, the same way the Maaser that the Levites separate has to be from the choicest part. Kach Maaser shemafrishim Yisrael, min ha'geiden u'min ha'yekav, min ha'chelev shabai. So too the Maaser which the Jews take and give to the Levites from the granary or from the wine press have to be given from the choicest. Halacha Yudalit. Here's a difference between Truma and Maaser. Truma, we said, that the 2% should not be calculated exactly. It should be calculated by approximation. However, ein me'asrin be'oimed, the 10%, we don't take with approximation. Ela b'mida, b'mishkal, b'minyan. Choose a process, either volume, weight, or number, but you got to count it out exactly. Whoever is precise in the amount is even more praiseworthy. You give too much Maaser, you're actually messing your grain up. Because you have untithed produce mixed in them. Maaser means 10%, no more than 10%. More than 10%, the other stuff has to be tithed. The rest of the fruit are fixed. But what you added to the Maaser is actually you're messing up the Levi. If someone only chooses to take part of the Maaser, what he separated is not Maaser. It's simply like dividing the grain pile. Which would then mean when you split the grain pile, you have to take from each part the proper Maaser. Ketzah, what does that mean? You have 100 pounds. Okay, it's 100 pounds of grain. How much is 10%? 10 pounds. You didn't take 10 pounds. You took 5 with the intent for Maaser. It's worthless. You have to take only 10%, not 5. But now that you divided the grain pile, Torah is not going to allow you to exempt these 5 pounds by taking Maaser from the other 95 pounds. From these 5 pounds, you have to take 10% of themselves, which is half a pound. And we do that because you separated it in the wrong way. Halacha Tazayin, hamafrish Maaser zeh, mevarech tchila, kederech shemevarchen ala mitzvahs. When a person separates this 10% to the Levi, he makes a bracha. Like any other mitzvah, you make a bracha. V'chein mevarech al Maaser sheni, v'al Maaser ani, v'al Maaser min ha-Maaser. You make a blessing when you take the second tithe, the tithe to the poor, the tithe from the tithe, that's the Levi's 10% that he gives to the Kohen. Mevarech al kol echad b'fnei atzma, you make a blessing on each one individually. But if you were being a good farmer and you're separating all your gifts one after the other without even talking in between, so like tefillin, right? If you put on your hand tefillin and your head tefillin separately, you have to make 2 separate blessings. But if you make a bracha in the beginning and you don't talk, one blessing covers them all. So here too, if you are separating all the tithes together without talking, you can include them all in one blessing and make the following bracha. Lahafrish trumos u'maisros. Blessed is Hashem who commanded us to separate all the trumas and all the maisros together.